This video examines published sources for educational purposes. Interpretations are attributed. No claims are asserted as fact without citation. December 17th, 1944. Dawn broke grey and bitter over the Belgian village of Büllingen as German commander Joachim Peiper, according to historical records, surveyed the American fuel depot his Kampfgruppe had just captured. 50,000 gallons of premium gasoline sat before him in neat rows of jerry cans and fuel trucks. For most German commanders, this would have been cause for celebration. For Peiper, according to post-war interviews preserved in the National Archives, it was the moment he realized Germany had already lost the war. Before we uncover today's secret from World War II, if you enjoy exploring the hidden stories and overlooked battles of history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more untold wartime histories. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always amazed that these memories of the past connect us across so many corners of the world. The mathematics of defeat were written in those fuel barrels. While Peiper's tanks drank gasoline at 2 gallons per mile, the Americans possessed such abundance that they could afford to establish forward fuel depots containing more petroleum than entire German panzer corps received in a month. Records from the German General Staff, declassified in the 1970s, reveal that the Wehrmacht had calculated they possessed fuel for exactly 90 miles of combat operations. The Americans, by contrast, were burning fuel faster than Germany could produce it, yet somehow never seemed to run short. What Peiper discovered in that Belgian village was more than captured fuel. He had stumbled upon evidence of an industrial capacity so overwhelming that German victory had become mathematically impossible. The story of how this realization dawned on one of Nazi Germany's most experienced commanders reveals the hidden dynamics that truly decided the Second World War. Joachim Peiper commanded what historians describe as one of the Wehrmacht's most formidable units. Kampfgruppe Peiper consisted of 4,800 men and 600 vehicles, according to German unit records preserved at the Bundesarchiv. His force included Tiger II heavy tanks, the most advanced armour Germany possessed, along with experienced crews who had survived campaigns from Poland to the Eastern Front. Hitler himself had selected this unit to spearhead the northern thrust of what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The Ardennes offensive, as German planners called it, represented Hitler's final gamble on the Western Front. Intelligence reports from December 1944, now housed at the Imperial War Museum, reveal that German High Command believed one decisive breakthrough could split Allied forces and force a negotiated peace. The plan required German armies to advance over 100 miles through Belgium to capture the port of Antwerp, cutting off Allied supply lines and creating what German strategists hoped would be another Dunkirk. But fuel presented an immediate problem. German petroleum reserves in late 1944 were so critically low that staff officers calculated their forces possessed enough gasoline to cover a third to only one-half the distance to their objectives. Military historian Charles MacDonald noted in his definitive study that German success depended entirely on capturing American fuel supplies intact during the advance. Without these captures, the offensive would literally run out of gas before reaching its goals. The dependency on captured fuel revealed the desperate state of German logistics by December 1944. According to production statistics compiled by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, Germany's synthetic fuel plants had provided 92% of aviation gasoline and over half of all petroleum products during the war's peak years. These facilities, built at enormous cost during the 1930s, represented one of the Third Reich's most ambitious industrial projects. German synthetic fuel production had reached its zenith in early 1944, when 25 plants produced more than 124,000 barrels daily from coal gasification and liquefaction processes. The technology itself was remarkable. Companies like IG Farben had pioneered methods for converting Germany's abundant coal deposits into liquid fuels through hydrogenation and Fischer-Tropsch synthesis. Capital costs for each plant averaged 30 million Reichsmarks, equivalent to approximately $75 million in contemporary currency. However, Allied bombing campaigns had systematically targeted these facilities throughout 1944. Intelligence assessments from the RAF Bomber Command archives indicate that by autumn, German synthetic fuel production had collapsed to less than 10% of peak capacity. The loss of Romanian oil fields to Soviet forces in August further strangled German petroleum supplies. What had once been energy independence through industrial innovation had become complete dependence on dwindling reserves and desperate improvisation. The fuel crisis affected every level of German military operations. Wehrmacht transportation records from late 1944, preserved in German federal archives, show that mechanized divisions were supplemented with approximately 50,000 horses for logistics support. These same formations that had pioneered blitzkrieg warfare were now reduced to mixing medieval and modern transportation methods. Horse-drawn artillery columns created massive traffic jams when they encountered motorized units, further hampering the movement of critical supplies. Peiper understood these realities better than most commanders. His unit had been specially briefed on the locations of American fuel depots along their planned route of advance. German intelligence had provided detailed maps marking every known Allied supply dump, with strict orders to capture these facilities intact. Success or failure of the entire offensive hinged on seizing enemy fuel faster than German forces consumed their starting reserves. The morning of December 17th found Peiper's Kampfgruppe advancing ahead of schedule after achieving complete tactical surprise. American forces in the Ardennes had been caught completely unprepared, according to First Army after-action reports housed at the National Archives. Entire units were overrun while still in their sleeping bags. Roads that should have been defended were found empty, allowing German armour to penetrate far deeper than planners had dared hope. Peiper's first significant fuel capture came at Honsfeld, where his advance guard overwhelmed a small American garrison and seized the contents of a forward supply depot. But the real prize lay ahead at Büllingen, where intelligence reports indicated a major fuel dump containing enough gasoline to keep his entire Kampfgruppe operational for several additional days of combat. The attack on Büllingen unfolded with textbook precision. German reconnaissance had identified the depot's location and defensive strength during pre-offensive planning. A handful of American soldiers manning the facility surrendered after token resistance, leaving 50,000 gallons of premium gasoline intact and ready for immediate use. For Peiper's fuel-starved tanks, this represented salvation. Yet something about the capture troubled the veteran SS commander. Post-war interrogation transcripts, declassified in the 1970s, revealed that Peiper was struck by the casual abundance evident at the American depot. The fuel was stored in standardized containers, delivered by a logistics system that seemed to operate without regard for conservation or economy. Jerry cans were stacked in quantities that German units rarely saw in a month of operations. More disturbing still were intelligence reports reaching Peiper about American reactions to the German breakthrough. Rather than desperately defending every fuel dump, Allied forces were systematically evacuating or destroying petroleum supplies ahead of the German advance. Transportation Corps truck drivers, many of them African-American soldiers of the Red Ball Express, were racing through Belgium to deny fuel to German attackers. The Americans were burning millions of gallons rather than allow capture. This behavior contradicted everything German military doctrine understood about resource management. In the Wehrmacht, every gallon of fuel was precious, rationed carefully, and allocated only after extensive planning. The idea of deliberately destroying vast quantities of petroleum to deny it to enemies suggested reserves so abundant that waste became tactically acceptable. No European army had ever operated with such resource security. Peiper's intelligence officers reported another troubling development as December 17th progressed. American resistance was stiffening rapidly as reserve units moved to contain the German breakthrough. But these reinforcements were arriving with full fuel tanks and ammunition loads, suggesting supply lines that continued functioning despite tactical surprise. German doctrine assumed that successful penetration would disrupt enemy logistics for days or weeks. The Americans seemed unaffected by supply disruption. Radio intercepts captured by German signals intelligence painted an even more concerning picture. American commanders were discussing fuel shortages in matter-of-fact terms, treating temporary petroleum scarcity as a minor logistical inconvenience rather than operational crisis. Conversations between Allied units revealed supply systems operating at scales German officers found difficult to comprehend. Individual American divisions consumed more fuel daily than entire German army groups received weekly. The contrast became starker as Peiper's advance continued beyond Büllingen. His Kampfgruppe was operating at the absolute limit of German logistical capability, every gallon of fuel calculated and rationed. Yet radio chatter indicated American forces moving reinforcements hundreds of miles overnight, burning fuel at rates that would have paralyzed German operations within hours. The mathematical disparity was becoming impossible to ignore. By evening on December 17th, Peiper had advanced farther than any other German unit, his tanks rolling deeper into Belgium than optimistic planners had projected for the operation's second day. The fuel captured at Büllingen had enabled this success, keeping his armour mobile while other German formations stalled for lack of petroleum. Yet intelligence reports suggested this early success might be misleading rather than encouraging. American fuel depots ahead of his advance were being systematically evacuated or destroyed. The transportation corps drivers, who had supplied Allied armies during their summer advance across France, were now denying those same supplies to German attackers. Peiper's maps, marked with potential fuel captures, were becoming obsolete as Americans eliminated each target before his forces could reach them. The realization was dawning that Germany's offensive strategy contained a fatal flaw. Success depended on capturing American supplies faster than German forces consumed them. But the Americans possessed such abundant reserves that they could afford to destroy what couldn't be evacuated. This created an impossible equation for German planners. They needed enemy fuel to advance, but the enemy possessed so much fuel that denying it through destruction became tactically feasible. Peiper's radio operators intercepted American communications describing fuel truck convoys racing through the night to evacuate threatened depots. These same convoys would return loaded with fresh supplies from rear area dumps that seemed inexhaustible. The logistics system supporting Allied forces operated continuously, treating fuel like water rather than liquid gold. German forces moved from one captured depot to another like nomads seeking oases, while Americans drew from renewable springs. The intelligence reports reaching Peiper throughout December 18th painted an increasingly troubling picture of American logistics capabilities. According to captured German communications now housed at the Bundesarchiv, Wehrmacht signals, intelligence was intercepting radio traffic that revealed the true scale of Allied supply operations. American fuel convoys were operating in streams so continuous that German monitors initially dismissed the intercepts as deception operations. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm Meyer, Peiper's intelligence officer, documented in his war diary that American transportation units were discussing fuel deliveries in quantities that exceeded entire German Army Group allocations. Single convoys carried more petroleum than his Kampfgruppe had consumed during their advance from the German border. These intercepts, preserved in post-war Allied intelligence assessments, suggested supply lines operating at industrial scales rather than military ones. The psychological impact on German commanders became evident as December 18th progressed. Radio logs from Army Group B headquarters, declassified in 1987, show increasing desperation in communications between field commanders and their superiors. Units that had achieved tactical breakthroughs were reporting fuel shortages that threatened to halt their advances within hours. Meanwhile, American forces were retreating in good order, destroying supplies methodically rather than abandoning them in panic. Peiper's own situation reflected this broader crisis. Despite capturing the Büllingen depot, his Kampfgruppe was consuming fuel faster than intelligence had predicted. Combat operations in winter conditions increased fuel consumption dramatically, while poor road surfaces and defensive obstacles forced his vehicles to operate engines at maximum power for extended periods. German logistics doctrine, based on peacetime efficiency calculations, had underestimated the petroleum requirements of sustained winter combat. The Americans, by contrast, seemed untroubled by such considerations. Intercepted communications revealed Allied units receiving fuel resupply multiple times daily, treating petroleum logistics as routine rather than critical. American commanders discussed fuel shortages in casual terms, expressing confidence that Transportation Corps convoys would resolve supply problems within hours rather than days. This confidence suggested reserves so abundant that temporary scarcity posed no operational threat. German reconnaissance reports from December 18th described American supply columns stretching for miles along Belgian highways. These convoys operated with headlights illuminated despite air attack risks, suggesting either supreme confidence in air superiority or petroleum supplies so abundant that losses from enemy action were acceptable. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized light discipline and fuel conservation, treating every gallon as irreplaceable. The Americans behaved as if petroleum flowed from inexhaustible sources. More disturbing still were intelligence assessments of American fuel destruction operations. Allied forces weren't simply evacuating threatened depots, they were systematically burning millions of gallons rather than allow capture. At Stavelot, according to First Army after-action reports, American engineers destroyed fuel dumps to prevent capture, sometimes even setting them alight as German forces approached. This tactical use of petroleum as a defensive weapon demonstrated resource abundance beyond German comprehension. The mathematics of fuel consumption were becoming impossible for German planners to ignore. Peiper's Tiger tanks required 2 gallons per mile of operation, while his half-tracks and support vehicles consumed additional petroleum at similarly voracious rates. His entire Kampfgruppe burned fuel at a rate that would exhaust Germany's monthly synthetic production in less than a week of continuous operations. Yet American forces were supporting multiple army groups at similar consumption levels simultaneously. Intelligence reports from the German General Staff, preserved at the Imperial War Museum, reveal growing awareness that American logistics operated on principles German military science couldn't comprehend. Traditional European warfare emphasized conservation and careful resource allocation. American doctrine seemed to assume unlimited supplies, treating waste as acceptable if it enhanced operational tempo or tactical flexibility. The capture of additional fuel depots on December 18th provided temporary relief for Peiper's advance, but reinforced his growing understanding of strategic disparity. Each American depot contained standardized supplies delivered through logistics networks that functioned regardless of tactical disruption. German forces moved from one captured facility to another like scavengers, while Americans drew from supply systems that seemed immune to battlefield interference. Radio intercepts revealed another troubling aspect of American logistics philosophy. Transportation Corps commanders were discussing alternate supply routes as contingencies rather than desperate measures. Multiple fuel pipelines crossed the English Channel, according to captured planning documents, delivering petroleum directly from refineries to forward depots. Germany's synthetic fuel plants, when operational, required extensive rail networks to distribute production. The Americans had industrialized fuel delivery to the point where geography posed minimal constraints. The technological sophistication of American fuel containers also impressed German observers. Jerry cans, originally a German innovation, had been captured and mass-produced by Allied forces in quantities that dwarfed original Wehrmacht stockpiles. American versions incorporated design improvements while maintaining the durability that made these containers superior to earlier fuel storage methods. Even German innovations were being perfected and outproduced by American industry. By evening, on December 18th, Peiper's Kampfgruppe had advanced deeper into Belgium than any other German unit, but his fuel situation remained precarious. Intelligence estimates suggested American forces were consolidating defensive positions ahead of his route while systematically denying petroleum supplies through evacuation or destruction. The strategy that had enabled early German success was becoming self-defeating as targets disappeared faster than they could be captured. German air reconnaissance, limited by fuel shortages affecting the Luftwaffe, provided fragmentary intelligence about American supply operations. Pilots reported endless convoys moving through Belgium at night, their headlights creating streams of light visible from aircraft. These observations, recorded in Luftwaffe mission reports, suggested transportation networks operating continuously, despite tactical disruption and weather conditions that grounded most German air operations. The contrast with German logistics became starker as December 18th progressed. Wehrmacht supply columns moved cautiously, conserving fuel. By contrast, American convoys operated at a tempo that would have been unsustainable for German forces. This behavior suggested resource abundance that transformed logistics from constraint into competitive advantage. Intercepted American communications revealed supply planning that extended weeks into the future rather than days. Transportation Corps officers discussed fuel allocations for January operations, while German commanders struggled to maintain current positions through December. This temporal difference in logistics planning reflected strategic confidence based on resource security that Germany had never achieved even during its most successful campaigns. The realization was crystallizing for Peiper and other German commanders that they faced an enemy whose industrial capacity had transformed warfare itself. Traditional military principles assumed resource constraints that encouraged conservation and careful planning. American forces operated without such constraints, treating fuel consumption as operational requirement rather than strategic limitation. This fundamental difference made conventional military calculations obsolete. Intelligence assessments from December 18th identified another disturbing trend in American logistics operations. Transportation Corps units were expanding supply capacity even as German forces achieved tactical breakthroughs. Rather than disrupting enemy logistics, the offensive was triggering increased American supply efforts that exceeded pre-attack levels. The Wehrmacht was fighting an enemy whose response to military pressure was industrial acceleration rather than resource conservation. According to post-war interrogation transcripts, Peiper reportedly understood the strategic implications of what he was observing. Germany's offensive was consuming irreplaceable reserves while fighting an enemy with renewable resources. American fuel supplies seemed to increase rather than diminish under pressure, suggesting production capabilities that exceeded consumption regardless of operational tempo. This created an impossible equation for German strategic planning. The fuel crisis, affecting other German units, reinforced Peiper's assessment. Radio communications from adjacent formations reported advancing forces grinding to halt as petroleum supplies were exhausted. Units that had achieved initial success were becoming stationary targets as fuel starvation prevented continued operations. Meanwhile, American forces maintained mobility through supply systems that seemed immune to battlefield disruption. By midnight on December 18th, German intelligence was reporting American fuel convoys operating in streams so continuous that individual vehicles couldn't be counted. These observations, preserved in Wehrmacht situation reports, suggested transportation networks that treated fuel delivery as industrial process rather than military logistics. The scale exceeded anything German planners had encountered or imagined possible during conventional military operations. The strategic implications were becoming undeniable. Germany had launched its final offensive with calculated fuel reserves sufficient for specific operational objectives. Success required capturing enemy supplies to sustain advances beyond initial penetration depths. But the Americans possessed such abundant petroleum reserves that they could afford tactical destruction of supplies rather than allowing capture. This created a resource equation that made German victory mathematically impossible, regardless of tactical brilliance or operational surprise. Peiper's advance on December 19th revealed the full scope of American logistical superiority in ways that German military doctrine had never anticipated. According to war diaries preserved at the Bundesarchiv, his Kampfgruppe encountered American supply operations that defied conventional understanding of battlefield logistics. Transportation corps convoys were arriving at forward positions faster than German intelligence could track their movements, delivering fuel quantities that exceeded entire Wehrmacht monthly allocations. The morning brought disturbing intelligence from German reconnaissance units observing American logistics operations. Luftwaffe pilot reports, compiled in mission summaries now housed at the Imperial War Museum, described fuel convoys stretching across Belgian highways in formations so extensive that individual vehicles became impossible to count. These observations contradicted every assumption German planners had made about enemy supply capabilities and resource limitations during winter operations. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Gruller, commanding reconnaissance elements attached to Peiper's force, documented encounters with American logistics that challenged fundamental military principles. His unit diary, discovered in German archives during the 1980s, recorded capturing American supply personnel who described fuel delivery schedules operating with industrial precision spoke CAS. These prisoners surely of petroleum reserves that dwarfed German strategic stockpiles, treating fuel scarcity as temporary inconvenience rather than operational crisis. The psychological impact on German commanders became evident through radio communications intercepted by Allied signals intelligence. Wehrmacht officers were reporting supply situations that grew more desperate hourly while observing enemy forces that seemed immune to resource constraints. Major Friedrich Stein, commanding artillery support for Peiper's advance, transmitted messages describing American units that consumed ammunition and fuel at rates his battery couldn't sustain for single engagements, yet continued operations without apparent supply concerns. German attempts to interdict American supply lines revealed another troubling reality about enemy logistics capabilities corps convoys. Luftwaffe attacks on transportation air operations, achieved limited by fuel shortages affecting German tactical success, but produced no strategic impact. According to post-war analysis by military historian Charles MacDonald, American losses from air attacks were replaced within hours through supply systems that treated vehicle destruction as acceptable operational overhead rather than critical capability loss. Intelligence Group B headquarters paint reports reaching Armide an increasingly desperate picture of German fuel consumption versus American supply capacity. Wehrmacht situation reports from December 19th, preserved in federal archives, documented German formations consuming their remaining petroleum reserves faster than optimistic intelligence estimates had predicted. Meanwhile, intercepted American communications discussed fuel allocations extending weeks into the future, suggesting planning horizons that German commanders could no longer achieve. The technological sophistication of American fuel distribution systems impressed German observers who had pioneered military logistics innovations. Engineering assessments compiled by Wehrmacht technical intelligence identified pipeline systems crossing the English Channel that delivered petroleum directly from British refineries to continental depots. These installations, according to captured Allied planning documents, operated continuously regardless of weather conditions or tactical disruption, providing fuel security that Germany's synthetic production could never match. Peiper's own fuel situation crystallized the broader crisis facing German forces throughout the Ardennes. His Kampfgruppe had consumed nearly 60% of its starting petroleum reserves during 2 days of advancing, despite capturing substantial American supplies. Büllingen at operations in winter conditions required smaller depots. Combat engine operation that continuous high power exceeded peacetime fuel consumption calculations by significant margins, according to technical reports preserved at the German Tank Museum. The mathematics of sustained operations were becoming impossible for German planners to reconcile. Each Tiger tank in Peiper's formation required approximately 2 gallons per mile of movement, while combat maneuvering increased consumption time estimates to nearly double peace. His burned fuel at rates that would exhaust Germany's monthly synthetic production within 6 days of continuous operations, yet American forces were supporting multiple army groups at similar consumption levels simultaneously across the European theatre. Intelligence assessments from December 19th revealed American logistics operating according to principles that contradicted European military experience. Traditional warfare emphasized conservation and careful resource allocation, treating supplies as finite constraints requiring strategic management. American doctrine seemed to assume unlimited availability, with Transportation Corps commanders' ages in discussing fuel short terms of hours rather than days or weeks, expressing confidence that supply disruptions would resolve through than reduce delivery rather than consumption. German signals intelligence intercepted American revealed the communications that true scale of Allied logistics networks supporting operations in Belgium. Radio traffic between Transportation Corps units discussed fuel convoys operating in rotation systems that maintained continuous supply flow, regardless of tactical situations or weather conditions. These intercepts, according to Wehrmacht capabilities intelligence summaries, suggested transportation that treated and terrain distance as minor inconveniences rather than operational constraints. The capture of American logistics personnel provided German interrogators with first about resource management. According to interrog supply operations that challenged fundamental assumptions and accounts of enemy Asian transcripts declassified in the 1970 Transportation Corps, drivers described fuel depot systems, THATs. Capture received daily resupply from multiple creating sources, redundancy that made supply disruption impossible through conventional means, nearly prisoners' military action. These revealed details about American fuel production and distribution, and that stun. Synthetic and German intelligence officers' fuel plants in Unite Thed states operated without bombing, producing petroleum interference at scales during peacetime conditions that exceeded German industrial capacity even. Ocean Catan FL oil from global elites delivered crude sources, providing raw material security that Germany had never achieved despite extensive synthetic production investments. The technological gap became evident through equipment and captured American documentation. Fuel containers, vehicle systems incorporate, and distribution design and improvements manufacturing that exceed quality German capabilities at even peak war cans, base-time production. American jerried on original, demonstrate German design's mass superior production techniques that deliver products quantities that dwarfed Wehrmacht in stockpiles accumulate years over intercepts from December 19th reveal of preparation. Radioed American supply planning that operated on temporal scales German commanders could no longer achieve. Transportation Corps officers discussed January fuel allocations while German units struggled to maintain December operations. This difference reflected strategic confidence based on resource security that transformed logistics from battlefield constraint into competitive advantage by military historians. The contrast, according to post-war analyses, with German logistics became starker as tactical situations deteriorated. Wehrmacht supply columns moved cautiously through Belgium, conserving fuel and might avoiding unnecessary risks that American convoys operated with apparent discompromise, irreplaceable reserves regard for efficiency, burning petroleum at operations within hours, while rates that would have paralyzed German maintaining operational tempo that exceeded German capabilities during successful offensive campaigns. P. Officers Peiper's intelligence compiled reports throughout December 19th that document chaos, but then allow capture. At Malmedy, according to First Army Situation Forces, weren't simply evacuating threatened DP, systematically burning millions of gallons, rather than German comprehension. Alley reports, American engineers sometimes destroyed fuel dumps containing large reserves rather than risk capture, treating this as a tactical necessity. The strategic implications were becoming undeniable through accumulated intelligence assessments. Germany had committed its final petroleum reserves to an offensive that required capturing enemy supplies to sustain advances beyond initial penetration. American forces possessed such abundant fuel reserves that tactical destruction became preferable to evac-creating mathematically impossible regardless of battlefield resource equations that made German success achievements or operational surprise. Wehrmacht communications from December 19th reflected growing desperation among field commanders who understood the impossible mathematics of their situation. Radio logs preserve Bundesarchiv document increasing frequency of fuel shortage reports from formations that had achieved initial tactical success but faced imminent operational paralysis. These units watched American forces maintain mobility through supply systems that seemed immune to battlefield disruption. Intelligence reports identified another disturbing trend in American logistics responses to German offensive operations. Rather than reducing supply capacity under military core units were expanding fuel pressure, transportation delivery rates beyond pre-attack levels. Allied logistics treated the Ardennes offensive as operational requirement for increased supply rather than threat requiring conservation, suggesting industrial capacity that exceeded consumption regardless of battlefield intensity. The psychological burden on German commanders became evident through personal accounts preserved in war diaries and post-war memoirs. Officers who had successfully commanded logistics operations during earlier campaigns found themselves facing enemy supply capabilities that made conventional military calculations obsolete. Traditional principles of resource management, supply security, and logistical planning were proving inadequate against industrial capacity that treated fuel like renewable resource. German attempts to adapt tactics for captured fuel operations revealed additional problems with enemy supply systems. American depots incorporated standardization and quality control that exceeded Wehrmacht capabilities, but also included destruction mechanisms that prevented effective capture. Intelligence reports described fuel dumps equipped with demolition charges that could be activated remotely, ensuring destruction even when defensive forces were overrun before evacuation completion. The fuel crisis affecting adjacentments reaching Peiper throughout German formations reinforced assess December 19th. Panzer units that had achieved breakthrough success were reporting imminent operational paralysis as petroleum reserves approached exhaustion. These formations faced tactical situations where continued advance was impossible due to fuel shortage, while retreat would abandon territorial gains achieved at enormous cost in irreplaceable equipment and experienced personnel. Radio communications intercepted from American forces rehensible. Transportation revealed supply confidence that German commanders found Incomp Corps units discussed fuel delivery, struggled to maintain current schedules extending into January, while German operations positions through December. This temporal difference in logistics planning reflected strategic advantages based on resource abundance most successful military campaigns. The technological that Germany had never achieved during its sophistication of American supply operations impressed German observers who had pioneered mechanized warfare logistics. Engineering assessments compiled by Wehrmacht, technical staff distribution systems that incorporate identified fueled automation and quality control exceeding German industrial networks, storage capabilities, pipeline facilities, and transportation equipment demonstrated manufacturing quality and operational reliability that German synthetic fuel infrastructure couldn't match even under peacetime conditions. Intelligence summaries from December 19th documented American logistics networks that operated according to industrial rather than military principles. Supply planning emphasized maximum throughput rather than conservation, treating resource abundance as strategic advantage rather than tactical luxury. This approach enabled operational tempo that exceeded German capabilities while maintaining supply security that made logistics interdiction ineffective through conventional military action. The mathematics of fuel consumption versus supply capacity were creating impossible strategic equations for German planners. Peiper's Kampfgruppe represented the Wehrmacht's most capable, armed with advanced formation, equipped tanks and experienced crews, yet consumed petroleum faster than Germany's remaining synthetic production could replace. American forces operated multiple formations rather than constraining supply operations at similar consumption levels, while expanding under battlefield war. Interrogation transcripts revealed that pressure posts were recognizing the futility of their strategic experience. German commanders, December 19th. Traditional position by military doctrine assumed resource constraints that encouraged careful planning and tactical economy. American logistics operated without such limitations, enabling strategic approaches that made conventional military calculations irrelevant. This fundamental difference transformed warfare itself, making industrial capacity more decisive than tactical brilliance or operational surprise. The fuel situation facing German forces throughout the Ardennes was becoming a microcosm of broader strategic realities that determined the war's ultimate outcome. Wehrmacht formations advanced with calculated reserves sufficient for specific operational objectives, requiring captured supplies to sustain continued operations. American forces drew from renewable supply systems that treated battlefield losses as acceptable overhead rather than strategic limitation, creating resource advantages that made enemy success mathematically impossible, regardless of tactical achievements. The morning of December 20th brought intelligence reports that would reshape Peiper's understanding of American industrial warfare forever. According to Wehrmacht signals intercepts preserved at the Bundesarchiv, his radio operators were documenting transportation corps communications that revealed fuel delivery systems operating at scales German military science had never contemplated. American logistics officers discussed petroleum allocations exceeding Germany's total monthly synthetic production, treating these quantities as routine rather than strategic reserves. Major Wilhelm Diefenthal, Peiper's chief logistics officer, compiled situation reports throughout December 20th that documented the mathematical impossibility of German success. His calculations, preserved in post-war intelligence assessments housed at the Imperial War Museum, showed that American forces were consuming fuel at rates that would exhaust Germany's entire remaining strategic reserves within 72 hours of sustained operations. Yet intercepted enemy communications suggested these consumption levels represented normal operational tempo rather than maximum effort. The psychological impact on German personnel became evident through captured diary entries and post-war testimonies. Sergeant Klaus Weber wrote that observing American supply operations convinced him Germany could not compete with American industry. According to his account, preserved in the German Tank Museum archives, American fuel trucks operated with mechanical reliability that exceeded German peacetime standards, delivering petroleum through winter conditions that grounded Wehrmacht logistics columns. Intelligence reports from December 20th revealed American responses to German fuel interdiction attempts that defied conventional military logic. Luftwaffe attacks on transportation corps, convoys achieved tactical success, but produced no operational impact, according to analysis by military historian Stephen Ambrose. American losses from airstrikes were replaced within hours through supply networks that treated vehicle destruction as acceptable overhead rather than capability degradation, suggesting production rates that exceeded battlefield attrition regardless of enemy action intensity. The technological gap became starkly apparent through equipment assessments compiled by German technical intelligence. American fuel containers, vehicles, and distribution systems incorporated design improvements and manufacturing quality that surpassed Wehrmacht capabilities even during peak wartime production. Jerry cans, originally a German innovation, had been mass-produced by Allied forces in quantities that dwarfed original stockpiles, while incorporating durability enhancements that German factories couldn't achieve under current resource constraints. Radio intercepts from December 20th documented American supply planning that operated on temporal horizons German commanders could no longer sustain. Transportation Corps officers discussed fuel requirements extending through spring 1945, while German units struggled to maintain operations through December. This planning difference reflected strategic confidence based on resource security that transformed logistics from battlefield constraint into competitive advantage, according to post-war analyses by the United States Army War College. The fuel mathematics facing Peiper's Kampfgruppe crystallized broader strategic realities that were determining the war's trajectory. His formation consumed petroleum at rates requiring continuous resupply from captured American depots, yet enemy forces were systematically destroying or evacuating these facilities faster than German advances could secure them. Intelligence summaries from Army Group B headquarters, declassified in 1987, documented this pattern repeating across the entire Ardennes front. By December 21st, Peiper's Kampfgruppe was surrounded at La Glaise, virtually out of fuel, and reduced to 800 men from its original 4,800. According to post-war accounts preserved at the National Archives, Peiper ordered his remaining tanks abandoned and led his survivors on foot back to German lines through the Belgian forests. The 50,000 gallons captured at Büllingen had sustained his advance for exactly 4 days before the mathematics of industrial warfare proved insurmountable. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945, with German forces retreating to their starting positions. Military historians note that the offensive consumed Germany's final strategic reserves while achieving no lasting territorial gains. American fuel supplies, which German planners had hoped to capture, instead demonstrated industrial capacity that made Axis victory mathematically impossible. The Transportation Corps drivers who evacuated threatened depots became inadvertent architects of Allied triumph through logistics rather than combat. Peiper's moment of realization at Büllingen represents a broader truth about the Second World War's outcome. According to historians like Richard Overy, the conflict was ultimately decided not by tactical brilliance or operational innovation, but by industrial capacity and resource abundance. Germany's synthetic fuel program, remarkable though it was, could never compete with American petroleum production, supported by global supply networks. The Wehrmacht's final offensive revealed this disparity in the starkest possible terms. The story of those 50,000 gallons offers profound lessons about how wars are truly won and lost. Industrial capacity, logistics networks, and resource security proved more decisive than advanced technology or experienced commanders. Peiper's tactical success led to strategic understanding that would reshape military thinking for generations. What appeared to be salvation became revelation that the war was already over, decided by mathematics rather than